we can say, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, now and forever. And in the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Let's go over the questions before the difficult ones before we go into our new session. I know it is going to be a lot of history, and I know some of you are not really excited about history, but we cannot skip over it, since we call the Bible is the record of history of salvation. Then we have to go through some history, not a lot of history. So let us go over the question. I think you have the most difficulty with the first and second question.
أديك بونبونية بونبونية من بتاعت سوز ها؟ إيه يا حبيبي؟ اللي رديت على حد؟ إيه يا حبيبي؟ رديت؟ لا نايم يا حبيبي.
So the first question goes like this. Regarding the temple, all the facts listed are true, except it took 7 years to finish. There's one wrong answer. Was built with cedar wood from Tyre. Was built in the southeast corner of the old city. Was built on the threshing floor of Arnon the Jebusite. Let us go back to the drawing and see where it was built. So the temple actually is the north part of the city, not the southeast, the north part of the city, according to the old maps, and it's the same today. So this is a mistake. It was made of cedar wood, yes, from Tyre, definitely. And it was on the threshing floor of Arnon the Jebusite, that's true. And it took 7 years to finish. The dynasty of kings of the North Kingdom of Israel interrupted because of lack of heirs. They had no sons. No, they did. Assassinations, that's the reason why any line will be terminated, is they were killing each other. And basically what we said last time is because they didn't believe that the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, had any covenant with God. So their reign didn't really matter. It was only a political thing, has nothing to do with their faith or relationship with God. But the covenant with David made it of absolute necessity that the line of David will continue to be the heirs of the kingdom. Wars, not all the time. Civil troubles, not really. The only thing that happened is assassination. So these are the two questions that we had struggled with the most. Now we just to go over what we have done before. We are in the covenant with David as the last piece, a last piece from the Old Testament before we move to the New Testament. Last piece of the covenant series. So we're moving on with the line of David and what happened. That's why we focus on the line of David. I didn't go much into Israel, and especially the prophets of Israel. Maybe we'll have next time a couple of words on Elijah and Elisha and the other prophets that appeared in the north. Today, what I want to do, and I want to make sure that you understand this, I want to without going into details, give you an overall picture of the prophets and how they related to the line of kings. Remember last time we said the covenant with David established three offices: the prophet, the king, and the high priest. Today, we will focus on the prophets. The prophets were major persons that had a lot of impact on the political and the spiritual welfare of the people of Judah. As we saw last time, we will see it again today, that Israel didn't last much. They ended on the hands of the Assyrian Empire in 720 BC. Very early or very late, you can say that, very late 8th century. Just to keep in mind that years are going backwards. We're going from 800 to 700 to 600. So when you look at the dates, they will go down, they will go smaller, not bigger, because we're talking about coming closer to the birth of Christ. Two pieces of information are important. So before we go on, the first piece of information is the counting down of the years. The second piece of information are the 4 or the 5 empires that existed in the Old Testament. And I want to give you this ahead of time, and I want you to pay attention to it because it will make a big difference in the way you study the prophets and the kings of the Old Testament. I want to see if there's another better map than this. So I want to go back to the map of what we call the Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent. What is the Fertile Crescent? It is an arc of green land that is surrounded by desert. Okay. I got myself stuck here. Okay, so I find any of those, one would just be opened up and be okay to look at. It's a simple one. So this is the Fertile Crescent. What do we say? What we call the Fertile Crescent? It's an arc of green land that starts at the Persian Gulf down. This is Kuwait today, Kuwait, and included the area between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this area is a delta of very lush land, very green. They call the area between the two rivers, because it is between two rivers, it's called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means the area between the two rivers. So when you call it, when you hear the word Mesopotamia, it is the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then the greenery comes down in a very slim area to Israel that goes through the north part of Syria and Lebanon and then Israel. It should extend to the delta of the Nile down the Nile Valley. So you have green strip on the right side on the east north, and you have a green strip on the left side to the east south. The northeast is Mesopotamia, the left and the east south is, and the west south, I'm sorry, the southwest is Egypt. So Egypt, because of the Nile, it's green, and the Mesopotamia area is green, and together they make the Fertile Crescent. So if you want to talk about empires, great civilizations, big, great civilization, you're going to have to find them in these two areas. I'm not going to talk much about the Egyptian civilization. There's no need to be talking about it. It's a very old civilization, but they were not the first people to start a civilization. The beginning was, as people say, it is the Sumerians. Sumerians arose in Mesopotamia, this area. And after the Sumerian, they were conquered by another race, the Akkadians. The Akkadians and the Sumerians were completely assimilated in what later becomes the first empire, a great empire in history, that is the Assyrians. So we talk about Assyrians. This is not Syria. Assyria is Ashur in Arabic. Assyria is not Syria. Ashur is not Syria. So Assyria is the empire that ruled Mesopotamia, replacing the Sumerian, the first civilization, and the Akkadians. So you can tell me, at one point you say, so Abraham came from what we call the Chaldeans. What is the Chaldeans? Abraham was in Ur of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans is an area out of the Assyrian Akkadian empire. It's here somewhere. So maybe he were down a little bit. So you can say that Chaldeans is also part of the Assyrian empire. So this is where we start the first empire, the Assyrians. The second empire that conquered the Assyrians are the Babylonians. From the Assyrians had certain names, that's very famous names. For example, one of the most famous names of the Assyrian kings or emperors is Sennacherib. Sennacherib or Sanherib is the ruler of Assyria during its time of expansion at their strength. Assyrians were very famous for their brutality. They were brutal. They were actually the most brutal of all the empires. When they conquered the country, they killed a lot. And they kind of broke the morale of the people before they conquered anyone. Then they were conquered by the Babylonians, and the leader who kind of broke through the Assyrian empire and led to its fall is Nebuchadnezzar, the famous ruler. We hear about him from the book of 2 Kings and also from Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar is the ruler or the army leader from Babylonia that conquered the Assyrians and took their land. And Nebuchadnezzar all the way defeated even all the way to Egypt. The Babylonians took their time and they went, and they were conquered by the Persians. And the leaders that conquered the Babylonians, his name was Cyrus. And when Cyrus took over the empire, Cyrus was from Iran and next to Iraq on the border here. And he came from Iran, Persia, and conquered the Babylonians, and he started the rule of the Persians, who had it co-ruled with the Medes. The Medes were another country north up here. So between the Medes and the Persians, the empire was shared, and they called it in general in history the Persian Empire, but it is Persian Medes co-reign. Then after that, the Persians were defeated bitterly by Alexander the Great to establish the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire included a lot of the areas outside the Crescent. It went all the way to Europe and all the way to this side, to China. Alexander the Great died, and his empire was divided. And then came the Roman under the leadership of Octavius, who was named himself Augustus Caesar, and began the rule of the Roman Empire. So you have those 5 empires, one after another. The Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians and the Medes, then the Greeks, then the Roman Empire. And by the coming of the Roman Empire, especially in the time of Augustus Caesar, Jesus was born, and we began entering into the New Testament. So this introduction is very important. I might add it to your handout just to keep these little pieces of information handy. So when you look at things, you would understand. And then we have big things here in our mind. Geography, we're talking about Fertile Crescent. Fertile Crescent is made of Mesopotamia on the northeast, and you have Egypt on the southwest. In between them, you have that little, this is Sinai, this little piece of land, which is a green land, which we call it the Promised Land or Canaan or Palestine or the land of Israel. And they connect, this land connects with Lebanon, connects between the Mesopotamian side and the Egyptian side. That's why it's a very crucial piece of land. It has the bridge or the passage between the two big empires, and all the trade routes would have to go through the land of Israel to reach from one side of the crescent to the other. These were two big hubs of trade, and this was the route between them. The empires, again, we said that from history, we started by the Assyrians. And I just don't want to ignore that before the Assyrians, the first civilization was the Sumerians. And there's a lot to be told about the Sumerians and their culture. Very sophisticated people who were conquered militarily by the Akkadians. The Akkadians were stronger, but yet less civilized. And the Sumerian culture kind of dominated the Akkadian culture. But then both of them were assimilated into the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire took over all this area, went all the way to Israel, and threatened both Israel and Judah, took over Israel, completely demolished Israel. Judah survived by a miracle. And then the Assyrian Empire itself was knocked down and completely taken up by the Babylonians on the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the general at the time. Then after that, the Babylonians were defeated by Cyrus the Great, coming from Iran, Persia. That's the old name of Iran, Persia, the Persian Empire. And they started the Persian Empire co-reigning with the Medes, another kingdom next to it. So the Medo-Persian Empire, but in general history would call them the Persian Empire. They went all the way until the time of Alexander the Great, who came from Greece and conquered the Persians, the Persian Empire, and took over all these areas. And he went very far, even to China. And his kingdom was divided after his death to 4 parts, which was taken by the Roman Empire in the time of Augustus Caesar, who established the rule of the empire over all these lands. In the time of Augustus Caesar, we have the coming of Christ. He's the one who made the census, you remember. Okay, so we're talking about 5 empires and a piece of land that they are fighting over. We go and now we study. So this is a preparation for us to kind of prepare for today's work. Now the talk is about the prophets, because the prophets is a big, complex work. There's 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. That's in the Hebrew, in the Masoretic. But what about the Septuagint? The Septuagint will have a little bit more. More in the number of books, but also more in the content. So for example, Daniel has an addition. Daniel has 2 stories that's not found in the Masoretic. And one of them we read during the Lent, the other one we read on the Bright Saturday. Then we have the book of Baruch, which is not part of the Masoretic prophets. I will stick for the purpose of study with the Masoretic Hebrew Bible for prophets. So we're talking about 5 major prophets and 12 minor prophets. How do you understand the prophets? Sometimes people go into the prophets and they pull their hair because they don't really relate to any of it. They don't understand who they're talking to. An oracle to Egypt, an oracle to Edom, an oracle to Ammon, an oracle to Assyria, an oracle about Babylon. How we understand these things? Sometimes it's a good oracle. Sometimes speak about people in a great favor. Say, God says in Isaiah, I called on Cyrus the Persian leader, my anointed. He called him a Messiah. Cyrus is a Messiah. And then that's how Isaiah make him. So how do you really relate to them? I tell you, if you want to understand the prophets, you would really have to study the history, the historical background, and then it would make a lot of sense to you what they're talking about. Your real lesson about the prophets will be if you understand the Book of Kings from a historical perspective. So who were the prophets during the reign of the kings? Because we did go through the list of kings from David all the way to Jehoiakim and Jehoiakim and Mattaniah or Zedekiah, who was exiled to Babylon, and the Nebuchadnezzar had killed his children before he plucked his eyes, and he died miserably in exile. So what happened? What is the story in the world? The work of the bigger picture of history. They divide. I got this piece from the Jewish Study Bible, and if you it's a very beautiful article done by one of the editors of the Study Bible, and he divided in this article, and I think this is based on the work of scholars, the prophets into 4 periods. They said the prophetic work can be divided into 4 periods. Listen carefully. Okay. The first period is the early monarchical period, means at the beginning of the reign of the kings, the time of David and the time of Saul, and maybe early Solomon. All the way, and I will remind you again, we're going back in history from 11th century, means 1,100 years before Christ, to the 9th century, which is the 800s before Christ. So you have this 200 years where prophets have a special character and a special mission before the kingdom was divided. And then you come closer to what we call the Assyrian crisis. And even this early period, the first one, goes into the divided kingdom too. But then you come closer to what we call the Assyrian crisis in the 8th century. When I say 8th century, I mean the 700s BC, 780, 750, 755, etc. The other group will be centered around the Babylonian crisis, which is late 7th, means when I say late 7th, again, I don't want to confuse you, but be awake. When we're talking BC, late 7th century would be 720, not 780. 780 in the BC becomes early 7th century. But you want to say late, you're coming closer to 700. You're coming backwards toward the 700. So Babylonian crisis is late 7th and early 6th centuries, means 590, 580. These are early 6th century. So we're talking about the Babylonian crisis. Another group is centered around that time. And what happened in that time, we will look into it in a little details. Well, the 4th group is once they come out of their land, out of Jerusalem and Judea, the kingdom of the south, the kingdom of Judah, will be exiled. And then they will come back to their land 70 years later, which is mid-6th through mid-5th century, from 650 to 550, from 550 to 450 BC. 6th century here is 500s. 5th century is 400s. From 550 to 450 BC. That's post-exilic restoration. So you have 4 groups. And the 4 groups are centered around major events, and you will see them. And then if you can keep those graphics in your mind, or even refer to them back when you want to study the prophets, it will help you very much, to help you greatly. Let me show you this in a map, and I will go back and look at it again. This is the thing that I want you to look at. Let me just view it as I don't know if that's going to be good. I don't think it's going to be good.